Is it water with the sheep in the box?
Alright, so I kind of covered the topic of queer serial killers in my recent documentary about serial killers, but since putting that video out, a bunch of transphobes decided to just double down and insist that actually I was cherry picking and that sure, the examples I gave in that video may not have been proof that trans women are inherently violent or prone to serial killing, despite the fact that they had been used as examples of trans serial killers well before I corrected the record, but moving the goalposts is the bigots' favourite pastime, it seems. But what about these other examples? You're just ignoring the obvious monsters in order to protect trans women. So in this video we'll be going over the most often cited counter example when one points out the bullshit inherent to this whole idea and explaining why it's bullshit. Before we do, however, I just wanted to reiterate the point that statistically trans women are extremely underrepresented as a proportion of serial killers, and pointing to one or two examples of very real monsters, like for example Beat Schmidt and Donna Perry, who for the record fit neatly within the expected serial killer model extremely closely and their gender was functionally irrelevant to their motives or methods, doesn't prove much beyond that yes, some trans people are capable of great evil, but statistically at nowhere near the levels of cis people, and especially cis men. I could just as easily use examples of cis women who have committed dreadful acts of violence and claim that actually, based on the victims of Myra Hindley and Karla Homolka, it's cis women, not trans women, who are the real danger to society, but I'm not going to because obviously this is a nonsense argument. But just FYI, the rate of cis women being serial killers is significantly higher than that of trans women. This video does not exist to make the point that trans people are incapable of being serial killers, or indeed to claim that there have never been any serial killers who transitioned later in life after receiving a lot of therapy and counselling in prison, because attempting to do so would be both pointless and granting the transphobes the premise that individual trans people are representative of the whole in any way, shape or form. Plus, I front-loaded this video with two prime examples of actually trans serial killers. No, this video exists to put to bed the claim that Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, was a secret trans woman, dismiss the narrative of trans women being violent and perverse monsters based on cis men being violent and perverse monsters, and hopefully, as a result, weird transphobes will stop commenting the exact same shit on my documentary, thinking that this is some kind of epic own or gotcha of some kind. Who am I kidding? I'm gonna have to make another video about this at some point, aren't I? Oh well, I guess I'm a true crime YouTuber now. So to reiterate before we get into the main body of the video, trans women are overwhelmingly likely to be the victims of violent crime as opposed to the perpetrators, statistically speaking, and are underrepresented as a group among serial killers, as even The Silence of the Lambs, the movie that popularized the idea of the trans serial killer and which was partially based on the case of Ed Gein, acknowledges.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Clever girl. Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect. There are three major centers for transsexual surgery: Johns Hopkins, the University of Minnesota, and Columbus Medical Center. I wouldn't be surprised if Billy had applied for sex reassignment at one or all of them and been rejected.
Billy hates his own identity, you see, and he thinks that makes him a transsexual. But his pathology is 1,000 times more savage and more terrifying.
So, was Ed Gein a trans woman? Well, first of all, who was Ed Gein? Edward Theodore Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul, was an American killer and body snatcher. It's debatable whether or not he technically counts as a serial killer because he only killed 2 people, at least as far as we know, but it is heavily suspected that he did kill more. Gein became infamous in 1957 after authorities entered his home and discovered what has become known as a House of Horrors, and it was revealed that he had exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and even items of furniture from their bones and skin. In the end, Gein confessed to killing 2 women, tavern owner Mary Hogan in 1954 and hardware store owner Bunny's Warden, and was declared guilty very shortly thereafter. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. let's start from the beginning, shall we? Gein's childhood, as is pretty much expected of serial killers at this point, was fucked up. First off, the basic facts. Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin on August 27, 1906, the second of two sons of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Gein had an older brother, Henry George Gein. Gein's childhood was tense and difficult at the best of times. His mother hated his father, an alcoholic who was unable to keep a job, which was only exacerbated when they sold the family business, a local convenience store, and up and moved the family out of the city to live in isolation on a farm in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. For many, this would be idyllic, growing up in the countryside away from the hustle and bustle of the big city, and much more freedom than can be enjoyed in such a place as well, but sadly it was not to be. Gein's mother took advantage of the farm's isolation to control and wield power over her children, turning away outsiders who could have influenced her sons, describing their move as an escape from the immorality of the city. For most of his childhood, Gein left the farm only to attend school and struggled to make friends due to the fact that he smelled bad, thanks to his mother's insistence that he perform some farm tasks before leaving every morning for school. It was during this time that he suffered tremendous physical, emotional, and potentially sexual, though this last one is pure speculation, abuse at the hands of both of his parents. As a result, Gein grew up with a few issues, shall we say, on top of his pretty serious pre-existing mental health problems, which were only diagnosed in adulthood at his eventual murder trial. A couple of brief incidents to mention here to illustrate the level of issues and abuse Gein suffered with as a child. At the age of 7, Gein witnessed his parents slaughter a pig on the farm, and in doing so experienced an ejaculation. At age 12, he was caught by his mother masturbating in the bathtub. She grabbed his genitals, squeezed them, and called them the curse of a man. This shaming and demonizing the idea of sexuality would continue for as long as she lived. Outside of school, Gein spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. His mother was fervently religious and preached to her boys about the innate immorality of the world, the evil of drinking, and her belief that all women, apart from herself, were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She reserved time every afternoon to read to them from the Bible, usually selecting verses from the Old Testament and Book of Revelation concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. You know, like normal people do. Gein was shy, and classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes. To make matters worse, Augusta punished him whenever he tried to make friends. It's clear that this child was suffering and had a lot of unresolved mental health and or neurodivergence issues, but at no point was this ever addressed, and Gein, the troubled boy, grew into Gein, the messed up man. Augusta Gein died of complications from a second stroke at age 67. Gein, who for most of his life had doted on and dearly cared for his mother, broke. Now an adult, he reacted by boarding up his mother's bedroom and sitting room to be preserved, museum style, as they had been when she was alive, and well, we know what happens next. Oh, you don't? 18 months after Augusta died, Gein, driven by intense loneliness and what he later said to be strange visions, began to visit the cemetery where his mother was buried every night, or as close to every night as was feasible. After several visits, he began to dig up corpses. The first body he dug up was that of his mother. Twisting her head off with his bare hands, Gein took the head and shrunk it, similar to the way the books he had taken to obsessing over spoke of. Gein began making nocturnal visits to as many as 40 cemeteries, frequently leaving without any offence, but on at least 9 occasions he dug up the coffins of newly buried middle-aged women. He'd scouted out these women in the obituaries of local newspapers. He would take out what he wanted and then recover the graves so as to avoid detection. Besides masturbation, Gein denied ever having had a sexual experience in his life and stated that he never had sex with their bodies because, in his own words, they smelled too bad. His cravings and compulsions still fall under the category of necrophilia, however, so to be honest, he may as well have for all the difference it made. And I mean, if the only reason you're not fucking a corpse is it smelled bad, I mean, that's indicative of what you would like to do if they didn't smell as bad, right? Gein also, of course, killed several local people, although he claimed that this wasn't due to any kind of hate or anger or even a compulsion, but simply because in the winter the ground at local cemeteries became increasingly difficult to dig up, so he needed to get creative in order to obtain bodies for his macabre hobby. In the end, after arousing suspicion among locals, his house was raided and what was discovered there was beyond belief, and of course inspired multiple horror movies, including the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho, as well as, of course, Silence of the Lambs. A county sheriff's deputy discovered Bernice Warden's decapitated body in a shed on Gein's property, hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrists. The torso was dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Searching the house, authorities found, and I hope you're ready for this, very, very big content warning right here for this list, whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on his bedposts, female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skin from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of human heads, one victim's face mask in a paper bag, a skull in a box, an entire head in a burlap sack, a heart in a plastic bag in front of the stove, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, a young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old, a belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails from human fingers, and the list goes on. If you really want to, you can find pictures of most of this shit online, but I do not recommend looking it up. When questioned, Gein told investigators that between 1947 and 1952 he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he was in a daze-like state. On about 30 of these visits, he said he came out of the daze while in the cemetery, left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. On other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother and took the bodies home, where he tanned their skins and otherwise took parts of their body to make his paraphernalia. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman's suit so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. This is the part transphobes cling to, of course. A violent, murderous cis man creating a human suit after a severe mental health breakdown is the exact same thing as a trans woman existing and living her life in peace to these people, and I honestly cannot understand how anyone can take them seriously after admitting to believe something as fucking unhinged as that. During questioning, County Sheriff Art Schley reportedly assaulted Gein by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible because, well, yeah, no shit. Schley died of heart failure at age 43 in 1968 before Gein's trial. Many who knew Schley said he was traumatized by the horror of Gein's crimes, and this, along with the fear of having to testify, especially about assaulting Gein, caused his death. One of his friends said he was a victim of Ed Gein as surely as if he had butchered him, which, I mean, I guess I kind of understand the sentiment, but maybe police brutality is always bad, and it had the opposite effect here, calling the confession into question. So, was Ed Gein a trans woman? Well, no. There is little to no evidence that this case could be compared to that of, say, Donna Perry, because from what we've seen of serial killers we can study, their gender identity rarely, if ever, actually has much of an impact on whether or not they choose to become violent. And many of the myths surrounding Gein are suspiciously similar to bigoted beliefs held by gender-critical and or transphobic people online. In short, the idea is that Gein, like trans women in these people's minds, wanted to violate, control, and own women, up to and including putting on a woman's suit made from the skin of women he killed and or grave robbed, which, if you're a deranged bigot, I guess is somehow comparable to a trans woman wearing a dress, you know, if you're not aware of how things work. Anyway, the point is that much like the so-called cross-dressing killers I covered in the main video, this is once again a cis man with fucked up ideas about gender and sexuality due to abusive childhood trauma, severe mental health issues, he was actually declared criminally insane at trial, and a mental break that occurred immediately following the death of his mother. Ed Gein was not attempting to become a woman, as many online have taken to claiming, but in fact to resurrect or to channel a very specific woman, his own mother. If you think that this is in any way comparable to trans people's view of themselves and their gender, you've clearly never bothered to talk to any actual real trans people about their reasons and motivations for transitioning, because I've spoken to a lot of trans people, and surprisingly, I want to become my own mother mother in order to in some way bring her back from the dead is not chief among them. In short, the people who claim that Gein was a trans woman belong to one of two potential groups. They either don't know anything about him and just base their assumptions on pop culture osmosis and an association with Silence of the Lambs and other media based on this case, or they are unhinged bigots attempting to use scare tactics in order to villainize trans people for their own political reasons. Or I guess maybe you're just an idiot, who knows. If you believe that Ed Gein was a trans woman narrative at the end of this video, then pick one, basically. Oh, and in case we've forgotten the point I made in the main video, unlike trans women, who are quite rare among serial killers, a lot of serial killers have been bigots, specifically anti-LGBTQ+ bigots, who have targeted queer people and other sexual minorities in order to protect children, or simply out of pure disgust. For example, the Bodies and Barrels killers, who targeted queer people throughout Australia because they believed them to be a danger to children, and Colin Ireland, known as the Gay Slayer, who killed queer people due to, in his words, a feeling of intense hatred and disgust towards deviation from the cis-heteropatriarchal norm, or, as he put it, extreme male degeneracy. These sentiments should sound familiar to anyone who spent any time listening to the rhetoric of anti-LGBTQ+ advocates, of course. We don't hate the queers, we just want to protect the children from them. And anyway, they're perverse and weird. Have you heard this one hilarious joke I heard?